Have you ever felt a temptation so strong that you knew it was wrong, but you still couldn't resist? That was me. I never expected to fall into an affair, much less with our driver. It started off so innocent, like a game I didn't even realize I was playing, until my husband caught us and everything came crashing down. It all began when my husband hired Alex. He was supposed to help out, to take the weight off my shoulders, especially with my husband's constant traveling for work. At first I didn't pay much attention to Alex. He was polite, professional, always on time. He did his job and left without much fuss. But as time went on, I started noticing little things about him. The way he'd smile when he greeted me. The warmth in his voice when he asked how my day was going. These were things I didn't get from my husband anymore. My husband was always so preoccupied with work. His phone constantly buzzing, meetings running late into the night, and the endless business trips that kept him away from home for days at a time. I didn't want to admit it at first, but I was lonely. Our marriage had become more of a routine than a relationship. We didn't fight, but we didn't connect either. We barely even talked, except about schedules or what groceries we needed for the week. So when Alex started asking me how I was doing, it felt like someone finally saw me again. It wasn't just about the words, it was how he listened. Really listened. He wasn't distracted. His attention wasn't divided. I told myself it was harmless, that it was nice to have someone to talk to during those long, lonely days. But deep down, I think I knew I was crossing a line, one small step at a time, until I found myself too far to turn back. The first real shift happened on an ordinary afternoon. My husband had left for yet another business trip, and Alex was driving me to the grocery store. The car was quiet, except for the low hum of the engine. And out of nowhere, I just started talking. I told him about how distant things had become between me and my husband, how I didn't even feel like I was in a marriage anymore. I hadn't planned on saying any of it, but the words just came out like a flood. I couldn't stop. Alex didn't say much, but he didn't need to. He just listened, nodding here and there, offering me a sympathetic smile. When we got to the store, I felt this strange pull. Instead of getting out of the car right away, I lingered. I didn't want the conversation to end. And that's when it happened. Our eyes met in the rear-view mirror, and for a moment everything felt charged. I quickly brushed it off, telling myself I was imagining things. From that moment on, things were different. Each time Alex came by to drive me somewhere, there was this unspoken tension. It wasn't anything obvious, not at first. Just the way his hand would brush against mine when he handed me something, or the way his eyes lingered a little too long when we said goodbye. My heart would race, and I'd feel this strange mix of guilt and excitement. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't seem to stop. This evening, my husband came home unexpectedly early from a trip. Usually, he texted me to let me know he was on his way, but this time, he didn't. I was sitting in the living room with Alex, just chatting about the day. It was casual, nothing out of the ordinary, or so I thought. But when my husband walked in and saw us sitting there, I saw the look on his face. He didn't say anything, but his eyes. It was like he already knew. My heart sank. For a moment, I thought he was going to confront me right then and there, but he didn't. Just stood there, watching us for a few seconds longer than was comfortable, then turned and walked upstairs without a word. The tension in the room was suffocating. Alex and I exchanged a quick glance, and I could tell he felt it too. But again, nothing was said. I thought maybe I was in the clear, that I could keep walking this dangerous line without consequences. But I was wrong. The next few days were quiet. My husband didn't bring up what he had seen, and I wasn't brave enough to ask him if he was okay. Part of me thought maybe he didn't care, that he was too busy with his own life to even notice what was happening right under his nose. But there was something about the way he looked at me during those few awkward moments. We did share. It was like he was waiting, testing me, almost daring me to slip up, and that's exactly what I did. As the days passed, the tension between me and my husband didn't ease. It only grew stronger. Every conversation we had felt strained, like we were both tiptoeing around something unsaid. He didn't confront me about the moment with Alex in the living room, and I convinced myself that maybe he hadn't seen anything suspicious after all. Maybe it was just my own guilt that made everything feel so heavy, but deep down, I knew better. I knew he had noticed. I just didn't know why he hadn't done anything about it yet. Despite the tension at home, my interactions with Alex didn't stop. If anything, they intensified. Every glance, every touch seemed to carry more weight now. It was as if knowing that my husband might suspect something only fueled the fire. It became more exciting, more dangerous. I found myself craving those stolen moments with Alex, moments where I could escape from the monotony of my marriage and feel alive again. Was like being caught in a whirlwind, fast, intense, and completely out of control. One afternoon, about a week after my husband had come home early, Alex and I ended up alone in the house again. My husband was supposed to be out of town for a few days, and I hadn't thought twice about inviting Alex in after he dropped me off from running some errands. We sat in the kitchen just like we had that day when my husband had come home unexpectedly. But this time there was no tension between us, just a simmering attraction that we both knew had been building for weeks. At first, it was innocent enough. We talked about our days, shared a few laughs, but as the conversation went on, the space between us seemed to shrink. I found myself leaning in closer, my hand brushing against his arm as I reached for my drink. I touched lingered a little too long, and instead of pulling away, I let it stay there. Alex didn't move either. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine, and in that moment everything changed. Before I knew it, we were kissing. It wasn't planned, it wasn't something we had talked about or even hinted at before. It just happened. Like we had both been waiting for this exact moment, and once it started, there was no going back. The thrill of it, the rush of knowing how wrong it was, made it all the more intense. I wasn't thinking about my husband, or what this would mean for my marriage. I was only thinking about how it felt to be wanted, to be seen, to feel something after so long of feeling numb. We didn't stop there. One thing led to another, and soon we were completely lost in each other. Every sound, every movement felt electric, and for the first time in a long time I didn't feel alone. I felt wanted, desired, alive. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it all came crashing down. In the middle of our heated moment, I heard the unmistakable sound of the front door opening. My heart stopped. My husband wasn't supposed to be home for another 2 days. There was no way it could be him. But as the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, reality hit me like a ton of bricks. It was him. My husband was home. Panic set in immediately. I jumped up, my heart racing, scrambling to gather myself as Alex did the same. There was no time to think. No time to hide what had just happened. The door to the kitchen creaked open, and there he was. My husband standing in the doorway. His eyes locked on the two of us. For a moment time seemed to freeze. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. The guilt, the shame, the fear. It all came crashing down at once. But my husband didn't say a word. He didn't yell, didn't ask questions. He just stood there, watching, his face unreadable. And somehow, that was worse than any anger or accusation he could have thrown my way. Alex stood frozen next to me, his expression a mix of shock and guilt. He didn't know what to say, and neither did I. My husband's silence was suffocating, the weight of it pressing down on me until I thought I might collapse under it. I waited for him to speak, to do something, but he just turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there with Alex, both of us unsure of what had just happened. I wanted to run after him, to explain, to say something, anything, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed with guilt and fear, my mind racing with 1,000 thoughts. Alex mumbled something about leaving, and before I could respond, he was gone, slipping out the back door and disappearing into the night. I was alone in the house that was supposed to be my home, with the man I had promised to love and cherish, and I had betrayed him in the worst possible way. After Alex left, the house felt eerily quiet. I stood there in the kitchen, not knowing what to do next. My mind was a blur, replaying the last few moments over and over. My husband had seen everything, there was no hiding it now. But what haunted me most was his silence. He didn't explode in anger, didn't demand answers. He just walked away, leaving me in this awful crushing uncertainty. I eventually made my way upstairs, bracing myself for what might come next. My husband was in his office, sitting at his desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. I hesitated in the doorway, waiting for him to acknowledge me, to say something, anything. But he didn't. The silence stretched on, heavy and unbearable. I wanted to break it, to apologize, to explain myself, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know where to start, or if there was even a point. Finally, he turned to me, his face calm, but there was something cold in his eyes that I hadn't seen before. I knew, he said, his voice steady but hollow. I knew this was coming. I opened my mouth to respond, but nothing came out. He stood up, walked past me without another word, and disappeared into the bedroom, leaving me standing there, feeling like my entire world had just crumbled around me. At night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling while my husband slept next to me. Or at least pretended to. The distance between us felt like miles, even though we were just inches apart. I didn't know what to expect in the morning, if there would be a confrontation or if he'd just leave me to wallow in my guilt. But the next day came, and nothing happened. My husband went about his routine like nothing was wrong. He got dressed, made his coffee, and left for work without a word. I tried to make sense of it. Was this his way of punishing me? Was he planning something, waiting for the right moment to confront me? The uncertainty knotted me, but I was too afraid to ask. The silence between us became unbearable, like a wound that wouldn't heal. Days turned into weeks, and still he said nothing. We lived in this strange detached limbo, barely speaking except for the most basic exchanges. It was as if we were two strangers living in the same house, pretending everything was normal. I thought about reaching out, about confessing everything. But every time I tried, I couldn't bring myself to do it. What was the point? He already knew. He had seen it with his own eyes. Eventually, the weight of it all became too much to bear. One evening, after dinner, I finally broke the silence. Are we just going to ignore this forever? I asked, my voice shaky, barely above a whisper. He looked at me, his eyes tired, and for the first time in weeks, I saw a flicker of emotion. I don't know, he said, his voice soft, almost resigned. I don't know if we can fix this. These words hung in the air between us, heavy and final. I knew then that things would never be the same. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, neither of us knowing what to say. Eventually, he got up and left the room, leaving me alone with the consequences of my actions. In the end, it wasn't a dramatic confrontation, or a fiery breakup. It was just over. The trust had been shattered, and no amount of apologies could fix that. We continued to drift further apart, until one day he packed his things, and left without saying goodbye.